Hey guys, Mustached. I'm here to review the video game Marvel's Spider-Man 2. Now, of course, this Let's Play is a little bit after the Game Awards that had awarded both this with nothing and Baldur's Gate with Game of the Year. And after really contentiously thinking about it, I can kind of see why people would, at least certain of them would, be wondrous as to why that would end up occurring. As someone who's currently also going through Baldur's Gate as well, I'm a little bit confused as well. You see, there is a whole slew of things wrong with Baldur's Gate 3, but that is for that review. But this video game review is meant to be focused in on Spider-Man 2. So, this follows up from the first game, and now you're Peter Parker going through a new journey, but this time you are alongside Miles Morales. And, furthermore, within the context of this story, you're facing off against Kraven, an interesting pick for a villain, I must boast about, as I don't think that is a pick that would have been too common, especially in his output. And along the way, there are villains that continue on from where they were, like Lee, or Mr. Negativity for Miles, and where that rage leads, as well as the introduction to Venom, and of course choosing Harry as that pick. And it additionally creates another version of a Peter, or a Spider-Man, but obviously inevitably becomes Venom. And it is an interesting story contained within this distinction between, or separation between, Kraven and Venom. And how that affects Peter, who is infected by the symbiote suit a little bit later on. Those negative connotations from Miles as well early on carries a pretty solid through line, I will say, in terms of where the story goes. And having the threat loom and change, where we see Venom become this force to be reckoned with and even play through a section of it, is something interesting to follow through with. But in terms of story, there are other side plots as well. For example, there's Yuri and her dealing with this fire guy who is obsessed with dealing with all these fires and had a flame relationship with Yuri, and they bring that to the forefront, and this clearly pushes the idea of carnage. So there's a lot of potential for where Spider-Man 3 can come in. And obviously there are other villains that can make an obvious mark, such as the Chameleon, as he does at the end tail of this story, as well as I mentioned, Carnage, and maybe a few slew of other characters that we have yet to have seen, yet portrayed in this iteration of Spider-Man. So yeah, its story is competent, I would say. And I initially heard some criticisms in the later portion of Spider-Man's, after a year long of thinking about it process, And I don't know how many of those critiques really hold. My, regards of error come more so in the gameplay rather than the story so far. As far as the story is concerned, I do think that this is a more complete story, or better yet, a more of a middle story that definitely feels like a third installment is prepped. But of course, Wolverine is taking precedent right now over of where Insomniac is currently. But I digress. So in terms of story, I think this is a solid story. I think they placed Kraven in a position that was formidable and had enough connective tissue alongside of Venom to offset that compelling story of where both Parker and Miles are going in this adventure. Now, in terms of gameplay, it expands from what I am aware of from Spider-Man 1. It has been a while since I have played Spider-Man 1 in terms of the Insomniac, series. From what I can remember, I'm pretty sure gliding was added as a sort of a tool to get around, as well as some combat mechanics specifically revolving around the whole Venom symbiote section of the game, which I have an issue with in none of these added implementations. It's more so the bugs that I've encountered along the way. Now, they weren't numerous, but they were noticeable, to say the very least. Like, for example, getting stuck inside a van for an insurmountable amount of time and not being able to escape until a reset occurred on my end. Other bugs included the name plating above being stuck long after the sequence that involved around that nameplate being there. And finally, just more generic and looser bugs such as the area failing to load for a temporary load of time, and then just having to swing around a bit or change the character's costume to change the reload sequence. So there were definitely minor bugs, some visual bugs, and then some actually reload your change pace bug as well. But outside of these bugs, I would argue that for the most part, outside of those, Spider-Man 2 is a compatible video game in terms of that regard. Its combat is fluid, very clear response times, though I do think that the limitations of the combat are most notable among one of the challenges in Miles' story. This deals with Mysterio. Mysterio has an offshoot of several challenges regarded all around New York, and one of them is to eliminate a certain number of enemies within this estranged platform. The time frame isn't particularly grand, so timing is everything. And the combat is really strained when under these constraints. It really shows that there definitely is some regard into where this game needs to tighten up its combat system. And within certain environments and within certain combat parameters of having that overwhelming of an enemy populace is definitely the stretch of where Spider-Man 2 begins to show its cracks in gameplay. But that is a relatively small portion of the combat, as it's only compounded in that particular combat challenge, and maybe a little more so in some of the other combat challenges, but they aren't as significant. So I do think outside of the combat challenges, this is easily, in terms of gameplay, a solid, again, a 7 out of 10 video game. And the bugs and the stretching of the combat shows that could have even been pulled down to a potential 6. So there's where I am in terms of gameplay. Its story, a little bit more solid. I'm struggling to think of any areas that felt weak or not as compelling. Again, they definitely threaded some stuff for a next game. But as the core enemies that are here, I think they addressed them fairly good as well in that regard. So I think, in all, Spider-Man 2, surprisingly solid game. I can see why it got nominated. I'm struggling a little to see why it didn't win any of the awards at that year's Game Award ceremony, but whatever. Anywho, that's my review for Marvel's Spider-Man 2. And if you ended up enjoying this review, then please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, make sure to check out those links in the description. One will head you over to my petition about small YouTubers. Second, to my PayPal, where you can help support me and my channel directly. And third, to my Discord server, where you can join, collab, chill, do all that cool stuff. And until next time, everyone, bye-bye.